The first phone call I ever got in a real crisis did not come from my wife. It came from my mother. I was 53 years old enough to know what loyalty looks like, old enough to know how quickly a life can split into before and after. And still nothing in me was ready for the sound of my 82-year-old mother trying to make her voice sound steady when it was already giving way. At 7:42 on a Wednesday morning, Rebecca Watson called me from her little house off Flatbush Street and said, "Wesley, my chest feels funny." She did not say it dramatically. That was what made it worse. My mother was not a woman who reached for help easily. 3 years earlier, after her hip replacement, she had taught herself how to move through pain with the stubborn privacy of someone raised to survive first and speak later. She had not asked anyone for anything meaningful in nearly a decade. So when she called me that morning and her voice sounded small, I knew this was not one of those calls you put off for 10 minutes. I knew this was the kind of moment that reveals who in your life is real and who has just been standing in the frame all these years pretending to belong there. My own car was at the mechanic. I was stuck between obligations, halfway dressed for a client meeting I suddenly no longer cared about, already reaching for my shoes, already moving toward the door in my mind. And then I turned to my wife. 23 years of marriage, 23 years of meals, mortgage payments, funerals, holidays, repairs, shared routines, silent resentments, and all the small habits that make people look permanent, even when they stopped being safe a long time ago. I looked at Eve, 51 years old, standing there with her coffee, calm as a woman waiting for the weather report, and I asked for one simple thing. I asked for her car keys. That was it. Not money, not a sacrifice, not a miracle. Just the keys, so I could get my mother to the ER. Eve did not blink. She did not ask how bad it was. She did not say, "Is Rebecca breathing okay? Should I come with you? Do you want me to call ahead? Should we call an ambulance?" She looked at me with that flat little distance she had perfected over the years and said, "She's your mother, Wesley, not mine." Then she lifted her cup and took another sip like she had commented on the traffic. I remember every detail of that second because my whole life seemed to go unnaturally quiet inside it. The light through the kitchen window, the magazine folded on the counter, the smell of burnt toast, the tiny scrape of ceramic against her wedding ring. I remember all of it because something in me understood, before my mind could put words to it, that a marriage can end without shouting. It can end in a normal voice, in a clean kitchen, at 7:42 in the morning, while one person asks for help and the other person decides to remain seated. I did not argue. I did not plead. Maybe that sounds strange after 23 years, but there are moments when the truth arrives so complete, the debate becomes embarrassing. I looked at Eve and felt, not anger first, but clarity. Cold, exact clarity. The kind that leaves no room for performance. She had said the sentence, and the sentence had done its work. In that instant, whatever I had been protecting in our marriage stopped breathing. I wish I could tell you I said something clever. I did not. I wish I could tell you I slammed the door, or accused her, or forced her to hear herself. I did not do that either. I just stood there for one more second with my mother still on the phone, listening, and said, "Mom, I'm getting to you. Hold on for me." Then I walked away from my wife and into the hallway, feeling like a man leaving one fire while running toward another. When people talk about betrayal, they usually imagine something loud, an affair, a stolen account, a lie exposed in public. But some betrayals are smaller in sound and much larger in meaning. Some betrayals happen when the person closest to you is finally given one undeniable chance to prove that your pain matters to them, and they decide it doesn't. That morning, my wife did not just refuse me her car. She told me, in 6 plain words, exactly where my mother ranked in her heart. And because my mother was a part of me no honest man could sever, she told me where I ranked too. If you have ever had a moment when somebody's calm response to your emergency told you more than years of conversation ever did, then you already know what I mean. You already know the strange stillness that comes over you when the mask slips and the truth stands there barefaced, asking you what you plan to do now that you can never unknow it. I did not have time to answer that question yet. My mother was waiting. Her voice had gone thinner. I could hear her trying not to scare me, which scared me more than panic would have. I told her again that I was coming. I told her to sit down, to keep the front door unlocked, to keep her phone beside her. Then I ended the call and reached for my own phone with hands that were steadier than I felt. Fear does something to you when the person in danger is the one who taught you how to stand upright in the world. It does not always make you loud. Sometimes it makes you efficient. But underneath that efficiency, something else had already started moving in me. Not revenge, not yet. Something more severe than anger and more final than hurt. A reckoning. Because when a man has spent years excusing indifference as stress, dismissing contempt as personality, and calling emotional absence a rough patch, one clean moment of crisis can pull every old memory into a hard, new shape. And as I stood there with my mother in pain, my car unavailable, and my wife behind me acting as if none of it belonged to her, I had the first clear thought that would carry me through everything that came after. The marriage I thought I was protecting had just told me it would not protect the people who made me who I am. If this story hits somewhere painful in you, stay with me. Because what happened after that morning did not begin with shouting or revenge. It began with one quiet refusal, one call for help, and one man finally understanding that sometimes the end of a life together arrives long before the paperwork does. I called the Uber before I even reached the front steps, and while I stood there waiting, I kept staring down the street like willpower alone could drag the car toward me faster. My mother's house on Flatbush Street was not far in miles, but distance feels cruel when someone you love is sitting alone with chest pain and trying to sound brave for your sake. The app said 12 minutes. 12 minutes. In ordinary life, that is nothing. In fear, it is a lifetime with numbers on it. I remember checking my phone, then the road, then my phone again, like the act itself could somehow change reality. Behind me, inside the house, Eve did not come to the door. She did not call out that maybe she had changed her mind. She did not appear with the keys. The silence from inside that house was almost worse than the sentence she had already given me, because now it had shape. Now it had duration. Now it was becoming a choice she intended to keep making. The driver finally pulled up, and I got in so fast I nearly left the door half open. I gave him my mother's address, then corrected myself and said, "No, St. Francis Hospital, as fast as you can safely get me there." He looked at me in the rearview mirror, caught something in my face, and nodded without questions. On the way there, I called my mother again. She answered on the second ring, and her voice sounded smaller than before, thinner somehow, like each word cost her more than the last. I told her the Uber was moving, told her to stay seated, told her to keep breathing slowly, told her I was almost there, even though I knew almost was a generous word for what 12 minutes feels like, when the person you love might be slipping somewhere you cannot reach. She said, "I didn't want to bother you, Wesley." That line nearly broke me more than anything else that morning. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was my mother in one sentence. 82 years old, chest hurting, alone in her house, and still worried about becoming a burden. That was Rebecca Watson. She would rather suffer quietly than interrupt somebody else's schedule. She had lived her whole life like that. Even after my father died, even after the hip replacement 3 years earlier, even after the body begins sending the kinds of warnings age likes to wrap in polite language, she still behaved as if needing help were a personal failure instead of the most human thing in the world. I told her she was not bothering me. I told her I was coming. I told her to listen to my voice and stay with me. And all the while, in the back of my mind, another truth kept circling like a dark bird with nowhere else to land. My wife had heard all of this. She had heard enough. She knew it was serious, and she had still chosen herself over a woman who had never once asked her for anything that cost real effort. The car moved through morning traffic, while every red light felt like an insult. I watched people walking dogs, carrying coffee, talking on sidewalks, living ordinary Wednesdays with the kind of carelessness that only exists when nobody you love is in immediate danger. There is something lonely about emergencies that happen in daylight. The whole world keeps moving as if your life has not just tilted. You want to roll down the window and tell everybody to make space, to understand, to feel the urgency with you. But they can't. So you sit there with your heartbeat in your throat and learn, minute by minute, how helpless a man can feel while still technically in motion. I called the hospital on the way. Then I called again. Then I called my mother one more time, and when she did not answer immediately, a cold wave moved through my body so hard that my hands went numb. She picked up after what could not have been more than a few seconds, but those seconds showed me exactly how fear strips you down to your original bones. By the time we reached St. Francis Hospital, I was no longer thinking in full sentences. I was thinking in fragments. Door, desk, name, room, breathe, move, ask, run. The Uber ride had taken 12 minutes, just like the app predicted, but by the time I got through the entrance, spoke to the front desk, gave my mother's name, answered their questions, repeated her age, repeated the chest pain, repeated Rebecca Watson, like repetition could force the world to take proper care of her. I looked up at the clock and saw 11:18 a.m. That time burned into me. 11:18. A strange thing to remember so clearly, maybe. But certain hours brand themselves into your memory because they divide who you were before them from who you became after. The woman at the desk told me my mother had already been taken into the cardiac unit. For 1 second, I just stood there. Not because I did not understand the words, but because I understood them too well. Cardiac unit. That was no longer a maybe. No longer discomfort. No longer a small scare we would laugh about after sandwiches and discharge papers. My mother had crossed into the kind of emergency you cannot soften with optimism. I thanked the woman, though I do not remember deciding to say the words, and followed directions down a corridor so bright and cold it looked scrubbed free of mercy. Hospitals have their own sound when you love the person inside them. The shoes on the floor, the distant wheels, the clipped voices, the monitor tones from somewhere you cannot see. All of it feels like a machine built to test whether you can remain upright, while the people you love become vulnerable under fluorescent light. I reached the waiting area outside the cardiac unit and finally stopped moving because there was nowhere left to run. That was the worst part. The motion had kept me from collapsing into the meaning of it. But once I sat down, everything came at me together. My mother alone in that house, the smallness in her voice, the Uber, the traffic, the word cardiac, and threaded through all of it, like a wire pulled tight enough to cut skin, Eve's voice saying, "She's your mother, Wesley, not mine." I did not cry then. I wish I could say I did, because tears would have been a clean release, something human and ordinary. What I felt instead was harder than tears. I felt my whole marriage rearranging itself in my mind under a harsher light. Because emergencies do not create character, they reveal it. And as I sat there outside the cardiac unit at 11:18 that morning, I realized something I should have admitted years earlier. A person does not become cruel in one sentence. They practice for it in smaller moments first. They rehearse it in little dismissals, cancelled obligations, cold expressions, withheld tenderness, private resentments they no longer bother to hide. By the time the real test comes, the answer is already there. That was the thought settling into me while I waited for news about my mother. Not rage, not yet. Just the first hard layer of understanding. Eve had not failed some sudden moral test she never saw coming. She had passed a test she had been preparing for all along. And sitting there in that hospital, knowing my mother had made it into the cardiac unit without me, knowing she had needed help while the woman I married stood 5 feet away and refused the smallest possible mercy, I understood that I had just reached the point where denial would cost me more than truth. Waiting rooms do something strange to memory. They empty you out just enough for old scenes to come back, sharper than they were when you first lived them. I sat outside the cardiac unit at St. Francis Hospital with my hands locked together so tightly they hurt. And while every part of me was listening for a doctor to come through those doors with my mother's name, another part of me was walking backward through years I had spent calling certain things normal, because naming them honestly would have forced me to act sooner. That is the hard thing about a real crisis. It does not only show you the danger in front of you, it throws light behind you too. And in that light, the past begins to reorganize itself. What looked like isolated moments starts to form a pattern. What felt like bad moods starts to look like contempt. What you excused as distance starts to reveal itself as something colder and more deliberate. I kept hearing Eve's voice in my head. "She's your mother, Wesley, not mine." It was not just the sentence. It was the ease of it, the absence of hesitation, the way she said it like the moral shape of those words had never crossed her mind at all. That was what stayed with me. Not heat, not anger. Ease. As if the line had been waiting in her for years. As if all that morning had done was give it a reason to come out. And once I let myself think that, other things started returning with a precision I had spent too long avoiding. Lunches. That was the first thing. Small, harmless, forgettable lunches. Or at least, that is how I had filed them away at the time. My mother used to ask Eve out every so often, always politely, always with that soft formality older women keep when they are trying not to impose on younger ones. A simple lunch, an early one, never inconvenient. Somewhere close, somewhere easy. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, nothing that asked for more than an hour and a little decency. And Eve would agree sometimes, or half agree. Or say, "We'll see," or smile that smile people mistake for kindness when they want peace more than truth. Then, more often than not, something would happen. A headache, a schedule change, a friend in town, an errand that suddenly could not move, a day that had become too full. At the time, each excuse had been small enough to survive scrutiny. That is how these things work. Cruelty almost never introduces itself all at once. It comes dressed in plausible reasons. It arrives one manageable disappointment at a time until the person on the receiving end stops expecting warmth and the person watching it starts calling it personality. Sitting there outside the cardiac unit, with the sound of distant monitors and rubber-soled shoes moving through the hallway, I pulled out my phone because I needed something to do with my hands other than let them shake. I do not even know what sent me there first. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe some part of me had finally become willing to prove what another part had known for years. I started scrolling back through messages, calendar notes, little reminders, the kind of ordinary digital crumbs that people leave behind when they think daily life is too unimportant to become evidence. And there it was. One cancelled lunch, then another, then another. 7 in the last 18 months. 7. Not one awkward reschedule, not 2 honest conflicts. 7 separate times my mother had tried to make room for my wife in her life, and 7 separate times my wife had found a way not to show up. The realization did not hit me like a shock. It hit me like something heavier. Confirmation. That is a darker feeling than surprise. Surprise can still bargain with reality. Confirmation cannot. Confirmation simply locks the door behind the truth and leaves you inside with it. I stared at the screen, going back over the dates as if the number might change if I looked long enough. It did not. 7 times. And once I saw that, I began remembering the tone attached to those cancellations. Not always mean. That would have been easier. Not always openly dismissive. Often just tired, just inconvenienced, just faintly irritated in that controlled way Eve preferred. She almost never exploded. She didn't need to. She had mastered something more effective than open hostility. She knew how to make care feel optional. She knew how to make effort seem excessive. She knew how to position basic kindness as a burden she was unfairly being asked to carry. And because she rarely shouted, because she kept her edges neat, because she could still function in public and host dinners and smile through photos, I had let myself believe that the problem was smaller than it was. That morning at the hospital, I finally understood how much damage can be done by someone who never loses control because they do not need to. Their indifference is organized. Their distance is intentional. Their refusal arrives dressed as reason. I thought about my mother setting those lunches up, probably choosing a blouse carefully, probably leaving the house early because older people still believe arriving on time is a sign of respect, probably trying not to read too much into each cancellation because dignity makes people protect themselves with hope longer than they should. That thought hurt more than I expected. Rebecca Watson had never demanded affection from Eve. She had not tried to run our marriage. She had not been intrusive. If anything, she had gone too far in the other direction. She had made herself easy to disregard. She thanked too much, apologized too quickly, brought little gifts when none were needed, tried not to stay too long, tried not to be a mother-in-law from anybody's worst story. And still, Eve had treated even her modest invitations like obligations beneath her. What kind of woman does that to an old lady who keeps reaching out with grace? What kind of man watches it happen for years and keeps translating it into softer language so he does not have to disturb his own life? That second question stayed with me, because by then I knew the answer to the first one was sitting back in my house drinking coffee as if the morning had asked nothing of her. The answer to the second question was harder because it included me. I had not created Eve's indifference, but I had certainly given it room. I had rounded off its corners. I had told myself she was complicated, tired, private, not demonstrative, under pressure, not naturally warm. I had used adult words to avoid a child's clear truth. Someone who cares shows up. Someone who does not care explains. And Eve had been explaining for a very long time. The hospital makes time move strangely. Minutes stretch, then vanish. Thoughts repeat until they sharpen. I kept looking toward the unit doors, waiting for a doctor, a nurse, any sign of movement tied to my mother's name. But in the stillness between updates, the pattern kept widening. The cancelled lunches were not the whole thing. They were simply the cleanest proof. Once I saw them for what they were, dozens of smaller moments began lining up behind them. Holidays where Eve seemed restless the second my mother started talking too long. Phone calls she encouraged me to cut short. Birthdays she remembered late unless I reminded her. That faint smile she wore when Rebecca repeated a story she had already told once before. A smile so small and controlled that most people would have missed the contempt inside it. I had seen all of it. I had seen more than I wanted to admit. But a man can live beside a truth for years if it asks something expensive of him. And the truth about Eve had always asked for something expensive. It asked me to confront the possibility that I had built a whole life with a woman whose basic loyalties ended exactly where inconvenience began. That is not a small thing to know. So I delayed knowing it. I let the evidence come to me in pieces too small to force action. Until that Wednesday. Until 7:42 on Flatbush Street. Until chest pain. Until car keys. Until the sentence that turned every old excuse to dust. By the time I found the 7th cancelled lunch, I did not feel confusion anymore. I felt the beginning of something steadier and far more dangerous to a bad marriage than anger. I felt moral certainty. Not performance, not wounded pride. Certainty. The kind that comes when the facts line up so cleanly that even grief cannot blur them. My wife had not merely disliked my mother, she had withdrawn ordinary human care from her over and over again, and she had done it so consistently that when the real emergency came, refusal was natural to her. That was the truth. She had practiced for that morning. Maybe not consciously, maybe not in words she would ever confess. But the pattern was there, and patterns do not lie just because people do. I leaned back in the hospital chair and looked down at my hands. The same hands my mother held when I was a boy crossing streets. The same hands that had signed mortgage papers with Eve, repaired gutters, carried groceries, shoveled snow, paid bills, kept a home running year after year under the assumption that effort and loyalty were still traveling in both directions. And I had one thought, clear enough to survive every emotion under it. I had married a woman I could no longer trust, near the people who mattered most to me. Once a man knows that, really knows it, he does not need a dramatic confrontation to move forward. He needs only the courage to stop pretending that love can out-argue character. And sitting outside the cardiac unit, while my mother fought through the morning she should never have faced alone, I understood that this was no longer about one cruel sentence. It was about a long history of absence I had finally decided to count. By the time a nurse finally came out with an update, I had been sitting with that truth long enough for it to stop feeling like a theory and start feeling like structure. My mother was stable for the moment, she said. They were still running tests, still watching her closely, still not ready to promise anything beyond the next few hours. Stable. It is a word people cling to in hospitals because it sounds like ground under your feet, even when it really means only that the fall has paused. I thanked her and sat back down, and for the first time since that morning began, I let myself take one full breath. Not a relieved breath, just a functional one. Enough air to think. Enough air to decide what came next. Fear had gotten me to the hospital. Clarity was going to have to take me the rest of the way. I stepped out into a quieter corridor and called Joanne. Joanne had been our family lawyer for years, though truthfully, she had started as my mother's lawyer before she ever became mine. My father trusted her, my mother trusted her. And because there are some people in life whose calm does not come from distance but from competence, I trusted her too. She answered on the second ring with the kind of voice that does not waste time performing concern. "Wesley," she said, "what happened?" I told her enough of it to matter. My mother, chest pain, St. Francis, cardiac unit. And then, because I was too old and too tired and too clear to decorate the truth, I told her the part that made the call necessary. I asked my wife for her car keys. She refused. There was a pause on the line. Not a confused pause, not a dramatic one, just the silence of a professional woman, instantly understanding that the legal question she was about to hear had not appeared out of nowhere. Joanne knew enough about life to understand that nobody makes a serious call from a hospital hallway because of one sentence alone. One sentence only matters that much when it lands on years of evidence. I told her I needed to understand exactly what in my life was actually shared. Exactly what had only become joint after the marriage. Exactly what still stood in my name because it came from before, from family, from inheritance, from the architecture my father and mother had built before Eve ever entered the picture. Joanne did not rush me. She did not tell me to calm down. She did not ask whether I was sure I wanted to be having this conversation today. She simply began laying things out in the kind of order that helps a man think when emotion is trying to crowd the room. Some things, she reminded me, had been added to shared structures after the marriage. Some accounts, some signatures, some conveniences created in good faith over time. That happens. People build a life together, and paperwork follows trust as if trust were permanent. But not everything follows. Some assets retain their original character if they were structured that way. Some inheritances do not lose their meaning simply because years passed and the wrong person got comfortable standing near them. Joanne knew the documents. More importantly, she knew where the lines were. And as she spoke, something in me became even quieter. Not because I was enjoying the conversation, God knows I was not, but because every sentence she gave me replaced fog with edges. There is power in edges when your whole life has just been exposed as softer in the wrong places than you realized. She reminded me that the original inheritance structure tied to my family had never fully dissolved into some romantic fantasy of ours. Certain protections were still there. Certain names still mattered. Certain decisions could still be made. My mother's position in my life had not been erased by marriage, even if marriage had slowly trained me to act as though it had. That realization landed hard. Not as greed, not as punishment, as order, as the correction of a moral imbalance. Because standing in that hospital hallway, I was no longer thinking like a husband trying to preserve appearances. I was thinking like a son who had just watched his mother face a medical emergency while the woman he lived with refused the smallest act of help. That changes the weight of everything. It changes how a house feels, how a signature feels, how a shared account feels. It changes the meaning of access. Joanne asked me careful questions. Did I want immediate protective steps, or simply a full review first? Did I want to begin separating what could be separated? Did I understand that some actions were administrative and some were symbolic, and often the symbolic ones carried the deeper consequence? I told her I did not want theatre. I did not want noise. I did not want threats. I wanted clarity. The word came out of me so naturally it surprised me, because I had not yet said it aloud that day. But once I heard it, I knew it had been forming in me for hours. I don't want revenge.
Joanne, I said, I want clarity.
Another pause, softer this time. Then she said, all right, then that's what we'll work from. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for a second. Hospitals are one of the few places where a man can feel grief and strategy occupying the same body without contradiction. 1 floor away, my mother was being monitored in the cardiac unit, and here I was, beginning the legal and financial disentangling of a 23-year marriage. To somebody outside it, that might sound cold. But outside, people always misunderstand timing. They think a marriage ends when the papers start. It rarely does. Most marriages end in the spirit long before the law catches up. The law simply arrives later to acknowledge what conscience already knows. Joanne began listing practical realities: the house, the deed structure, beneficiary designations. What could be reviewed immediately? What needed signatures? What needed timing? What needed patience so that every step would hold? She did not fill the call with speculation. She filled it with sequence. That mattered. Because betrayal makes the mind feel chaotic, and sequence is one way of refusing chaos the final word. I took notes on my phone while she talked. Short phrases, names, dates, documents, the kind of cold little lines that would have seemed impossible to imagine over breakfast a few hours earlier. Yet there I was, writing them down in a hospital corridor, and the strangest part was not how surreal it felt. The strangest part was how right it felt. Not pleasant, not easy, right. Like I had finally stopped protecting the wrong thing. Joanne reminded me that Eve had only been brought into parts of the financial picture after the marriage, after the years had made openness feel natural, after habit had disguised exposure as intimacy. But origin still matters. Timing still matters. Intention still matters. Those are not just legal ideas. They are moral ones. Who built what? Who brought what? Who preserved what? Who stood beside you when it mattered? And who revealed, at the first real test, that they had mistaken access for entitlement? I could hear pages turning on Joanne's end, could hear the efficient quiet of somebody already assembling the world back into legible pieces. I realized, listening to her, how starving I had been without knowing it for a form of seriousness that did not manipulate, delay, or pretend. There was no emotional fog in Joanne's voice, no self-protection, no blame-shifting, just facts shaped toward action. It made Eve's refusal that morning feel even smaller by contrast, smaller and uglier, because one woman had heard crisis and immediately moved toward order. The other had heard crisis and moved toward herself. That difference told me more about the architecture of my life than any anniversary ever had. Before we ended the call, Joanne said something simple that stayed with me. She said, "Wesley, you do not need to decide everything today. You only need to stop pretending you have nothing to decide." That line went through me with almost physical force, because that had been my real illness for years, hadn't it? Not ignorance, pretending. Pretending certain cuts were smaller than they were. Pretending absence was just temperament. Pretending my mother did not notice what any old woman with dignity always notices. Pretending that if I kept the peace long enough, peace and truth might become the same thing. They never do. Peace without truth is just deferred damage. I thanked Joanne. We agreed on the first steps. Review the documents. Protect what needed protection. Move carefully. Move correctly. And above all, move from clarity, not injury. When I ended the call, I stood there a moment longer with the phone still in my hand, looking out through a narrow hospital window at a washed-out sky that had the color of old paper. Somewhere back at the house, Eve was probably still functioning inside the ordinary shape of the day, perhaps already revising the morning in her mind, perhaps already preparing some version of events in which she had not done anything truly unforgivable. People like that are often very skilled at surviving inside their own edits. But I was done helping write them. My mother was alive, stable for the moment, and I had just learned something essential. The parts of my life that came from love, blood, sacrifice and family memory had not all been surrendered to the woman who sat at my kitchen counter and refused me the keys while my mother's chest tightened. That mattered, not because money outranks love, but because love, when betrayed, should not be rewarded with permanent access to what it once trusted someone to hold. I straightened, put the phone back in my pocket, and walked toward the cardiac unit again with a new kind of steadiness in me. Not relief, not peace. Something stronger and far less sentimental. Direction. My mother still needed me. The day was far from over. But now, alongside the fear and the waiting, there was also a line forming in my life that had not existed clearly enough before. And once a man sees that line for what it is, he may take a little time to cross it. But in his heart, he has already begun walking. My mother recovered slowly, which is another way of saying she suffered through the kind of fragile improvement that teaches you not to celebrate too early. In the days after that Wednesday, St. Francis Hospital became the center of my life. I measured time by nurse updates, cardiology rounds, medication changes, and the small mercies that start to matter when somebody you love has already crossed into the territory where everything feels uncertain. Rebecca Watson was still herself through all of it, which somehow made the whole thing both easier and harder. Easier because her mind was clear, harder because she kept trying to minimize what had happened, as though surviving a cardiac scare at 82 should not inconvenience anybody too much. She apologized for frightening me. She thanked every nurse twice. She worried about whether somebody had watered the plant by her kitchen window. That was my mother. Even in a hospital bed, even after that morning, she was more concerned with being graceful than being centered. I sat beside her and watched the rise and fall of her breathing, watched the monitors, watched the pale hospital light on her hands, and I kept thinking the same thing over and over. This woman had given me everything required to become a decent man. Time, food, correction, sacrifice, steadiness. The least I could do now was make sure the end of her life was not left exposed to the carelessness of somebody who had already shown me exactly what she was willing to do when it mattered. That thought was no longer abstract by then. After my call with Joanne, things began moving in the quiet, serious way real change moves. No speeches, no threats, no dramatic scenes thrown across the living room, just documents, calls, reviews, signatures, and the kind of deliberate protection that feels almost sacred when you finally understand how long you have left something undefended. Joanne handled it the way I knew she would, calmly. Precisely. She reviewed the structure of what had belonged to my family before marriage, what had been added later, what could be clarified, what could be redirected, what still recognized moral origin beneath legal convenience. There is a particular kind of shame in realizing you were more careful with routine expenses than with the deeper architecture of your life. But shame can still be useful if it finally teaches you to stop sleeping through danger. So I did not spend my energy grieving the fact that I should have acted sooner. I spent it acting now. One of the clearest steps involved the house. Not because a house is just money, it never is. A real family house is memory stored in wood, bills, repairs, photographs, seasons, and sacrifice. It is decades held in material form. It is where your mother waited for your calls, where holidays happened, where grief was carried quietly room to room after death, and somehow life still continued. The idea that someone like Eve could continue standing near that history with the same access after that Wednesday became impossible for me to tolerate. So we moved to restore what should have been protected all along. The beneficiary logic, the deed security, the direction of the asset itself, not recklessly, not sloppily, correctly, deliberately, in a way that recognized a truth I had taken too long to honor. My mother should never have been one emergency away from discovering that the wrong woman stood too close to what my family built. I remember the day I signed the key papers because my hand did not shake. That surprised me. People think those moments come with visible trembling, tears, anger, breakdown, all the outward signs of emotional drama. Mine did not. Mine came with an almost frightening stillness. Joanne sat across from me. The documents were laid out in a clean line. She explained each piece in plain language. I read every page. I asked what needed asking. Then I signed. In that room, I did not feel vengeance. I felt alignment. It is hard to explain that to people who think every consequence must come from rage. Sometimes the deepest actions come from the end of confusion. Sometimes the most final thing a man can do is not lash out, but quietly return order to where disorder has been tolerated too long. My mother did not ask me to do any of it. She did not even know the full extent of it right away. I would not have put that burden on her while she was recovering. She needed peace, medication, follow-up care, rest, and the security of knowing that her son was there. So that is what I gave her. I brought her home when she was cleared. I made sure her prescriptions were organized. I sat at her kitchen table and wrote out times and dosages in thick, dark ink, because older eyes deserve consideration. I stocked the fridge. I fixed the loose latch on the side door. I answered calls. I stayed longer than necessary. And every time I did one of those small things, I felt the rightness of what had already begun in the legal world too. Care should be matched by protection. Love should be matched by structure. Sentiment without action is just another form of delay. As for Eve, the silence between us thickened before it ever broke. She called me that next day 38 times. 38. I know because I looked at the screen at one point and felt nothing theatrical at the sight of it. Just recognition. There it is, I thought. Not remorse. Panic. Panic that the familiar arrangement had shifted and she did not yet know how far. Panic that the man who usually absorbed discomfort quietly had stopped providing that service. Panic that consequence, once theoretical, had entered the room and sat down. I did not answer those calls, not because I wanted to punish her by withholding sound, but because I had nothing to say until the truth was fully formed in me, and I was no longer interested in having important conversations before I had the moral ground to stand on clearly. People rush too often into confrontation because emotion wants an audience. I did not want an audience. I wanted clarity. By the day after, that clarity had moved beyond feeling and into fact. That was when the bank called her. Or rather, that was when the first outside sign reached her that the structure she had been living inside was no longer as stable or as available as she had assumed. Financial institutions have a way of sounding neutral even when they are delivering the first cold touch of reality. A question, a notification, a procedural contact. Nothing dramatic in tone, everything dramatic in meaning. Soon after came the call from the legal side. Not a thunderbolt, not a scene from television. Just one call, made once, carrying more finality than all 38 of hers put together. The contrast would have been almost poetic if it had not cost so much to get there. When Eve finally confronted me, it happened exactly the way these things usually do. Not with an honest opening. Not with, "I failed you. I failed your mother. I said something inexcusable. I see what that revealed about me." No, it began with confusion staged as grievance. "How could you do this without talking to me? Why are you shutting me out? Are you seriously throwing everything away over one bad morning?" Over one bad morning. I remember looking at her when she said that and feeling, once again, not surprise, but confirmation. Because that is how people protect themselves from the truth of what they have done. They shrink the event. They reduce the pattern to an incident. They turn the wound into a moment. They call the final straw an overreaction. because acknowledging the weight already on the man's back would force them to see who they have been for years. She was standing in front of me, asking me to join her in editing reality one more time, and I knew with absolute peace that I was done doing that. I don't want revenge, I told her. I want clarity. I said it exactly that way, and the room went still after. Because there are sentences that do not sound loud, but end arguments permanently. She looked at me as if she expected more. Anger, maybe. Accusation. A list of grievances. A man defending himself so that she could begin dismantling his defense point by point. But I gave her nothing messy enough to argue with. I gave her truth in its cleanest form. Revenge still keeps you tied to the person who hurt you. Clarity cuts the rope. Revenge wants them to suffer. Clarity only wants everything placed in its proper name. What she had done was not one bad morning. It was the visible peak of a long mountain of absence. What I was doing was not punishment, it was recognition. Recognition that a woman who can hear that an 82-year-old mother is having chest pain and still refuse the keys has no rightful place inside the deepest trusts of a decent man's life. I could see on her face that she understood more from that sentence than she wanted to admit. Not all at once, perhaps. People like Eve do not surrender self-justification easily. But somewhere, underneath the defensive posture and the outrage at being excluded from decisions, she knew. She knew that the issue was not optics, not paperwork, not the bank, not Joanne. The issue was that on Wednesday at 7:42 a.m. she had finally said the quiet part aloud, and from that point forward I was never going to be able to unknow her. That is what ended us. Not legal language, not signatures, not even the hospital. Her own clarity met mine, and mine survived it better. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something odd. I was sad, yes. A 23-year marriage does not disappear without leaving bruises, even when the ending is morally obvious. Routine itself grieves when broken. Chairs look different. Mornings sound different. Silence changes shape inside a house. But underneath the sadness was something I had not felt in years. Clean air. That is the closest description I have. As though my life, which had been slowly filling with a kind of stale, emotional weather I had learned not to question, had finally had a window opened. My mother grew stronger. The color came back to her face. She still tired easily, still moved carefully, still irritated me by trying to overdo small chores too soon, but she was here. She was alive. And with every follow-up visit, every meal, every afternoon spent sitting with her while she told stories she thought she had already told too many times, I felt more certain that whatever this cost me, it was still cheaper than continuing to live dishonestly. A man can absorb disrespect for years and still reach one cold, final line. Mine was a phone call my mother had to make herself. That was the line. Not because I stopped loving the image of the life I thought I had, but because I finally loved the truth more. If there is anything worth carrying out of my story, it is not that law can correct betrayal or that assets can be rearranged after character reveals itself. Those things matter, but they are not the center. The center is simpler. You learn who people are by who they become in your emergency. Not in comfort, not in parties, not in photographs. In the moment something real is asked of them. My mother called me at 7:42 on a Wednesday morning with a small voice and chest pain. My wife answered that moment with refusal. I answered it late, imperfectly, but finally with the only thing that still had honor in it: clarity. And once I chose that, everything else began moving toward its rightful place.